Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather. On today's episode, we're talking about the disappearance of Brian Shaffer. Brian basically disappeared without a trace, avoiding any public security cameras or being seen by any of his friends or who he was with. No foul play suspected. He just simply vanished. This case has been covered a lot, and there is a lot of information out there, a lot of which I couldn't verify with certainty. So if you have something to add, please do so in the comments. Let's get into it. Brian Shaffer is the oldest of two sons to Randy and Renee Shaffer, and he grew up in Pickerington, Ohio. He was born on February 25th, 1979. His older brother was named Derek, and it's said they got along well and had an overall healthy relationship. After graduating high school, he would go on to studying microbiology, then graduating after 6 years from Ohio State University. After that, he would attend OSU College of Medicine. Renee, Brian's mother, was also a microbiologist, so Brian was just naturally following in her footsteps. It said that Brian was very motivated, very intelligent, and he was also really liked in school. He loved music, and he played the guitar. That laid-back Jimmy Buffett-style music was his favorite, but he also loved Pearl Jam, so much so that he had their logo tattooed on his arm. If it wasn't for his medical career, his friends could definitely see him start his own band. Brian also had a girlfriend named Alexis Wagner while he was in medical school. It said they were madly in love, and friends all thought that Brian was preparing to propose to Alexis very soon. Brian also really liked relaxing beach vacations, and he and Alexis were going on a trip to Miami during spring break of 2006, which they were both really excited for. This was apparently a Christmas gift from his mother, and this trip was important for Brian for two reasons. One, because it was a gift from his mother, and two, his mother had actually passed away 3 weeks earlier. Renee sadly passed away from an aggressive form of cancer, which was really hard for Brian. He was more of a mama's boy. Of course, Alexis was there for him, supporting him during his grief, but he had also had medical school and needed to get through that. So getting away and going to Miami to unwind was just what he needed. And this was from his mom, so I would imagine it was also emotional for him. Friends would say that Brian was very stoic during his mother's battle with cancer. And while they understood his mother's death was hard on him, he seemed to handle it well, at least on the outside. Then, on Friday, March 31st, 2006, Ohio State University would be officially on spring break. Brian was said to be exhausted. He had pulled some all-nighters earlier in the week to do some last-minute cramming for his exams, but he was done, exams were over, and it was time to relax. So Brian and his father would go out for a steak dinner at Outback Steakhouse to celebrate his first day of spring break. Randy, his dad, would remember that they talked about Renee, Brian's late mother, and how they were really sad she passed away, and they both missed her. Brian would tell his dad that everything was going to be okay and that he, his dad, was going to be okay too. After dinner, despite being so exhausted, Brian would meet up with his friend Clint Florence around 9 p.m. at the Ugly Tuna Saloona, which is a bar in the South Campus Gateway complex in the University District. Brian had also invited his brother Derek and Derek's wife to the bar, but they were going to go to a comedy show that night, so they declined the invite. While at the Ugly Tuna Saloona, Brian called Alexis. He left her a voicemail basically saying that he loved her and that he was excited for their trip to Miami. Alexis was not at the tuna that night. She had decided to go to Toledo to visit her family before their flight on Monday. After he called Alexis, Brian and Clint would go bar hopping. It said that they went to a few establishments, having shots at each place before going on to the next location. Around midnight, they'd meet up with Meredith Reed, a friend of Clint's. Meredith had her car with her, so she offered to drive the two men back to the Ugly Tuna, and once they arrived, Meredith would go inside with them to have one last round of drinks. Now, at some point while at the Ugly Tuna, Brian got separated from Clint and Meredith. From what I understand, this place is basically a big square with the bar in the middle. So it's probably not too hard to find people, but Clint and Meredith were unsuccessful. I also don't know how busy it was there that night. According to Clint, it wasn't totally unusual for Brian to take off after a night of drinking. The good old Irish goodbye. So at 2 a.m. when the bar finally closed, Clint and Meredith waited outside basically to see if they could catch him on the way out. When that plan also failed, they just assumed he must have went home, so they left too. Meredith and Clint both say that they tried to call him during the weekend to check in, but neither of them were able to speak with Brian as they would just end up getting his voicemail. Alexis, his girlfriend, was also unsuccessful in reaching Brian, as was his father and his brother. When Brian didn't show up for the Monday morning flight to Miami, he was finally reported missing. Alexis would stay at Brian's apartment for 2 days after he missed his flight in hopes that he'd turn up. But sadly, Brian never came back. The Ugly Tuna was equipped with security cameras, so police would go to the Ugly Tuna first to see if they could find Brian on camera, see who he was last seen with, and what direction he had gone. It's also mentioned by some people that police did speak with staff at the Ugly Tuna who didn't see him after the bar was closed. There is a rumor that Brian stayed to hang out with the band after the bar closed, but that hasn't been proven, and I'd imagine they'd see him on CCTV camera leaving later. So the camera footage would show Meredith, Clint, and Brian entering the bar around 1:15 a.m., as per what Meredith and Clint had said. Again, depending on where you read your information, before Brian went missing, he was sitting at the bar with Clint and Meredith, as well as 2 girls. At one point, Clint got up to use the restroom and told Brian to stay put because sometimes they would lose him. Security cameras would show Brian outside the bar at 1:55 a.m., just before it closed, talking with 2 women. The 2 women he was sitting beside at the bar with Clint and Meredith. In the footage, it does look like he said goodbye to them before going out of camera range in the direction back into the bar. Here is a photo of Brian just at the edge of the camera range, and there are 2 police officers behind him. Since he goes off frame, it's only assumed that he went back into the bar because there really isn't anywhere else to go. Then the bar closes at 2 a.m. and everyone goes outside. But Brian wouldn't be seen on camera leaving the bar again at all. And this is all within 5 minutes where Brian would just disappear. Brian was between 6 foot and 6'2", good-looking guy that was literally just outside speaking with 2 girls close to 2 police officers. And I couldn't find anything on what those officers saw or noticed, but we're just going to have to assume that they saw nothing. All we know is that he went out of camera range and possibly back into the bar. Now, because Brian wasn't seen leaving the bar, police were curious if perhaps he put a hat on or disguised himself on purpose to leave the bar unnoticed. And I don't think he had brought additional clothes with him, so he would have needed to either steal a hat or borrow something from someone else. I do not know if anyone reported having lost clothing that night, but I'm pretty sure I read that everyone who was seen on camera were accounted for. Now, the only public access to the Ugly Tuna is the escalator, and it brings you to a landing where you turn right and go into the bar. There is typically 2 officers standing near the escalator who I assume redirect people towards the bar because to the left of the stairs is a theater. Out of camera view was the emergency exit. I'm not 100% on the layout, but from what I understand, the emergency exit led you down the stairs to the lower level of the building where you could either go out near the front door or go through a construction site. At the time, the building was heavily under construction and building new businesses in the lower level of the building. If Brian didn't go back into the bar, the only other exit he could have taken was the emergency exit. Police think it's highly unlikely he went this way due to the construction. In their opinion, a drunk person wouldn't have been able to navigate through the lower level and he would have needed to turn around. After listening to a few different podcasts, it sounds like this construction site was more of the building being renovated. The lead detective had said that the stores downstairs were, quote, completely dug up, end quote. But one of the guitarists from the band that played that night mentioned it wasn't that bad. He remembers that there might have been plywood boarding up some of the shops and plywood down on the walkway. So maybe not as dangerous as the police are insinuating. With that said, we don't know how far into the construction site this guitarist went either. There is also apparently a freight elevator that leads to a dumpster area, and the bar uses this area still, but apparently the dumpster area has cameras as well. The camera footage from this area wasn't mentioned for quite some time. A few years later, in fact, is when police said the footage didn't show Brian either, but it hasn't been released to the public. This exit is also one that is up for debate because some people say staff used this exit, but other reports say staff used the regular exit via the escalator. Without seeing the actual footage that night, we really don't know who used what exit the night Brian disappeared. Police would request security footage from other bars as well in the area to see if they could find him leaving the Ugly Tuna, walking down the street, or entering other places. But there was no sign of Brian on any other CCTV footage anywhere. Police would search the neighborhood, as did friends and family. They would search on foot, sometimes with police dogs looking at every nook and cranny by the bars, in dumpsters, asking residents. They put out flyers, even went to the sewer system to try and search there. But there was no Brian. Cadaver dogs were also brought through the construction site, but from what I could find, the only place where the dogs may have any indication of Brian was nearby Wendy's. But cadaver dogs aren't always reliable, and it was days later, so I don't know if I can trust he was there. Remember, Brian was seen speaking to two women outside the bar. Police did locate these two women, and their names were Amber and Brighton. It turned out that they were just being friendly, and the rest of their night had checked out with no ties to Brian. Brighton did an interview later on the Dead or Alive podcast, and while she doesn't specifically remember what they talked about that evening, she claims Brian started to kiss her neck. I guess during their flirting, she also put his phone number into her phone. And she goes on to say that Brian also offered to walk her and her friend Amber to their car in the parking garage. Amber and Brighton then went back inside so Amber could use the washroom. She said they came right back out and Brian wasn't there anymore. So Brian did not walk the girls to the car and they don't know where he went. Brian's car was still parked at his apartment and nothing out of the ordinary inside his apartment happened either. Even his glasses remained in his apartment. Nobody can understand how he just vanished. Police were starting to think that maybe Brian disappeared on purpose to be alone and grieve the recent death of his mother. But friends and family said that would have been totally out of character of Brian. And I can see why somebody would want to just go and start a new life after going through something traumatic. But in my mind, I imagine that they'd pack a bag, take some clothes perhaps, and then they'd alienate themselves. But Brian just disappeared with the clothes on his back with no money and nowhere to go. I couldn't find anything that indicated how much cash he had on him that night. Did he take out some before he went to the bar? Maybe he had enough on him that he wasn't overly worried about clothes or returning to his apartment for anything. His bank accounts have never been touched, and he hasn't attempted to access his money or his credit cards either. During the investigation, police would ask Brian's father, Meredith, and Clint to take a polygraph test. And that wasn't really because anyone was a suspect, but they just needed something. They needed a starting point because the police had nothing to go on. Brian's father and Meredith took one, but Clint refused for some reason. Clint was apparently really helpful at first, but as the investigation progressed, he hired an attorney and stopped talking completely. Police haven't confirmed if he is still a person of interest, but by Clint refusing to help would haunt Brian's family. They would think that he knows more and is hiding something. Clint apparently has said he has nothing to hide, was honest about everything from the beginning, and just didn't see the value in going through with the polygraph test. He was with Meredith in the bar, and he couldn't have done anything to Brian. If media does try and reach out to Clint, he directs any and all questions back to his lawyer and will not provide any comments whatsoever. Now, I could understand if you're feeling harassed or like you're a suspect, you might want an attorney just to be left alone. People close to Brian Shaffer claim that Clint wasn't as forthcoming as he claims, because as soon as the detectives started to get more involved, Clint started to have less and less contact with everyone. Derek, Clint's brother, has always thought Clint knows something more, whether that's where Brian took off to, who he was with, or what happened that night. Derek also mentions that Clint was the only person who had anything negative to say about Brian after the disappearance. Clint was Brian's old roommate, so he probably knew Brian pretty well. And it's possible that there is some secret or something more about Brian's personal life that just isn't public. And we do tend to speak of people who have passed in a really positive way, like he lit up the room or he was the life of the party. Not too many people release skeletons. And I don't know much about Clint, but maybe he was just a really blunt person. Some people just don't have filters and say things at inappropriate times. Without any evidence, police really don't have much else either. Alexis was really shaken up by Brian's disappearance and called his cell phone every single day, which would always go straight to his voicemail. And I'm sure that started to become a habit for her, but one day in September, 6 months later, the phone rang. Alexis called it frantically over and over, but Brian never answered. So Alexis went to police where they too called and heard the phone ringing. The ringing lasted several hours before it went dead again. Brian's cell phone provider, Singular Wireless, said it probably was just a glitch. The phone had also pinged in Hilliard, 14 miles northwest of Columbus. Apparently, according to Singular, this cell tower wasn't working properly from being overloaded. So it had allowed the phone to ring even though it was turned off. How the company knows the phone was off or on is questionable. I have zero knowledge on how cell phone towers work, but I always assume that if a cell tower was overloaded, it would just send calls to another tower. Also, is Singular implying that his phone was down there in Northwest Columbus, trying to connect to an overloaded tower? Coincidentally, Brighton, one of the girls who spoke with Brian that night, used to work for Verizon Wireless. And she seems to think that it's impossible for a phone to ping if it isn't turned on. So either Brian turned it on, or someone responsible for killing Brian turned it on, or maybe someone found it and turned it on. I tried to verify if that's true, if a phone needs to be turned on, but 2006 was a really long time ago, and I couldn't conclusively find if that was true. But most of what I could find nowadays does say that a phone can't ping or connect to a tower unless it's on. Brighton's personal, unprofessional opinion is that Brian is still alive. I have a hard time believing that if Brian wanted to escape and start a new life, he would go only 14 miles away, but stranger things have happened. Randy Shaffer, Brian's dad, once consulted a psychic who thought Brian was in the water near a bridge pier. So Randy and Brian's brother Derek searched and searched the waterways in Ohio. And this would start a rumor that perhaps Brian was killed by the smiley face killer. The smiley face killer was someone who targets college-aged men, typically drunk from the bar, kill them, and dump their bodies. He would then spray paint a happy face nearby the body, but this theory was later debunked, mainly because there was no body and no happy faces found. Pearl Jam's frontman Eddie Vedder also spoke out during one of his concerts in Cincinnati about Brian's disappearance, encouraging people to spread the word about Brian, but unfortunately, nothing came of that either. Sadly, in 2008, Randy Shaffer, Brian's father, passed away after being struck by a branch that had fallen in his backyard during a heavy windstorm. After his death, the attorney representing Clint Florence wrote to the private investigator who was helping the Shaffers and implied that he learned from the Columbus police that Brian was still alive. He would say, quote, "If Brian is alive, which I am led to believe after speaking with the detective involved, then it is Brian and not Clint who is causing family pain and hardship. Brian should come forward and end this," end quote. But Derek, Brian's brother, has thought about this a lot. Would Brian be so upset by his mother's death that he would just want to take off and start a new life? Derek had been invited out the night Brian disappeared. So would Brian actually invite him out if he was planning on taking off? Or was it sporadic? Was that night his last hurrah? Is that also why he tried to kiss Brighton and exchange phone numbers, because he knew he would never see Alexis again? Or was that normal behavior of his? Alexis isn't convinced that Brian is still alive. She believes he wouldn't have just run off and has probably since passed on. Brian's family has insisted from the start that Brian had no reason to fake a disappearance. Yes, he was upset by his mother's passing, but they didn't think he had motive to just disappear. Interestingly, in 2016, Alexis said in an interview with local and state news that a few days before Brian went to the bar, he told her to move on and find someone else because he was struggling with his mother's death. A few weeks prior to that comment, he asked her to just go away with him. So maybe he was planning on a departure and having a really hard time leaving Alexis. Alexis has since moved on and has married and started a new family of her own. There has been hundreds of false sightings, and police are still getting tips to this day. In 2020, a photo of an American man who was homeless in Mexico went viral with claims it was Brian. But FBI did facial analysis and determined it was not Brian. Not only do a lot of people think he's still alive and hiding, there happens to be a million other different theories. This case has been covered a lot by YouTubers, it's on Reddit, web sleuths, it's been in the media, so people have made up some pretty wild assumptions. Some of them range from the band killing Brian and taking him out of the bar through the service elevator, possibly hiding him in their equipment, to him accidentally falling down the elevator shaft. People think he was taken by a serial killer. I've heard he's overdosed in the bar and the staff are covering this up, or that he didn't make it out of the construction site, fell into a hole, or died from something on the site, and that the construction crew are covering it up, possibly buried him under some concrete. Lots of people still think Clint had something to do with it, and of course, suicide always comes up as well. Brian is still 100% a missing person. He would be 43 years old, and a recent digital age progression photo has been released in hopes that if he is still alive, someone would recognize Brian and come forward. There is a $100,000 reward if someone can provide information in locating Brian or his remains. My thoughts? This is a very strange case, and I think the fact that there's no way to know what happened after 1:55 a.m. just means that anything is possible. Anyone's theory could be right. If Brian is still alive, he obviously doesn't want to be found and has done a fantastic job at disappearing. It's too bad he hasn't reached out to his brother, but sometimes people have a really hard time returning. Sadly, I feel like suicide is a possibility, and he died in a remote location, or he was met with foul play and his body has just been hidden this whole time. At one point, I did think of him being in the construction site wasn't totally out of the realm of possibilities either, mostly because Brian wasn't seen on any other CCTV outside, but I need to know more about what the site actually looked like at the time. Was there a spot where he could have fallen and nobody noticed? According to the detectives, it was completely dug up, but that could mean a million different things. Was there huge holes or trenches or footings? Or did he sneak out of the emergency exit, hop into a cab, go somewhere completely random? It sounds like he was struggling with his mother's death, so maybe he did really just get down on himself, snuck out, and took off. With that said, all investigations have information that isn't released to the public, and I always wonder what that is and if it could lead to finding Brian. I think the worst part of this whole thing is that Brian's younger brother, Derek, is now without an immediate family. First, he loses his mother, then his brother disappears, and then his dad dies in a freak accident. How terrible is that? From what I could find, he's married and has a family of his own, but it's still really sad, and I'm sure he still struggles with this to this day. Where do you think Brian is? I want to know your thoughts. That's it for today. Thanks again for joining me here at Felony Spectator, and we'll see you again soon.